The Time Machine, Chapter 4, A New Kind of People. In a minute, we were standing face to face. He came up to me and laughed. If he was afraid of me, he didn't show it. He turned to two others who were with him. He spoke to them in a strange language. I couldn't understand a word of it. Others came up. Soon, 8 or 10 of these little people were all around me. One of them tried to speak to me. I shook my head. Then I pointed to my ears and shook my head again. I was trying to tell them I didn't understand their language. One of them stepped forward. She touched my hand. Suddenly, I felt all their tiny hands upon my arms and back. I was uneasy for a second. Then it came to me what they were doing. They wanted to make sure I was real. I told myself, why should I be afraid? I could pick the whole bunch up and throw them around if I wanted to. But then I saw them also trying to touch the time machine. Quickly, I went to the time machine. I took off the control bars and put them in my pockets. I couldn't let these creatures fool with the machine. It was my only way of getting home. Then I turned back to the little people. I would try to get through to them somehow. I also took a closer look at them. Their faces were as fine as those of little dolls. They all had curly blonde hair on their heads, but their faces and bodies were hairless. They had large round eyes. In a way, they looked like deer, with their thin lips and pointed chins. What surprised me was the way they acted toward me. Here I was, a strange creature among them, but they didn't seem to want to know anything about me. No one tried to speak with me. They just stood around smiling. Now and then they spoke to each other. Their voices sounded more like birds cooing than people talking. I tried again to get through to them. First I pointed to the time machine, and then to myself. I stopped for a second. How could I explain the idea of time travel? I pointed to the sun. To my surprise, one of the little people did the same thing. Then he made a sound like thunder. I was surprised. The dial on the time machine said that I was in the year 802,701. I had always thought that the people of the future would be far ahead of the people of 1895. Were the people of the future fools? This little person was asking me a question that a child of 1895 wouldn't ask. He wanted to know if I had come from the sun in a thunderstorm. I looked into his big eyes. I knew that I could never explain it to him. Instead, I nodded my head. Again, I pointed to the sun. I made the sound of thunder. They all took a few steps back and bowed to me. They probably thought that I was some kind of god. They began to pick flowers and make them into chains. They put those chains around my neck. In a few minutes, I was almost covered with flowers. One of them took me by the hand. With the others following, we walked toward one of the big buildings I'd seen. As we walked by the big marble sphinx, it seemed to smile at me. I smiled back. What a joke! This was the world of the future, and its people were no smarter than 5-year-olds. I didn't worry about the time machine being left alone. These people could never figure out how it worked. The building was bigger than I had thought. There were now hundreds of little people around me, but the building could have held thousands more. I looked closer at the great stone hall. Nobody took care of it. Little by little, it was falling apart. The floors were made of a shiny white metal, but as hard as the metal was, it showed signs of wear. It was as if thousands of little feet had worn it down. But how many thousands of years did it take? Small marble tables stood all around the hall. On these tables were piles of fruit. But what fruit! A strawberry was the size of a basketball, and an orange was bigger. The rest of the fruit was strange to me. The people made signs to me to sit down. Instead of chairs, we sat on pillows on the floor. They began to eat right away. They threw the peels from the fruit into holes that were next to the tables. They ate more like animals than people. I joined in, but with better manners. As soon as I finished my meal, I tried again to talk to the little people. There had to be some way to reach them. I began by making little sounds. I made my voice go up to mean I was asking a question. They thought I was funny. They saw me as a strange creature making noises. But I didn't let their laughing get to me. I kept at it. I felt like a schoolteacher in the middle of a crowd of children. But little by little, I got through. In a few hours, I had learned some words. I knew how to say you, me, her, him, and even hungry and eat. But it was slow work. Like babies, they grew bored very quickly. They would wander off. I knew then that my lessons would have to be short. There was another funny thing about them. They really were not interested in anything. I was something new to them. They kept coming up to me just to get a good look. But once they did, they'd go off to find a new toy. I went out of the great hall to explore. I was surprised at how much things had changed. When I left my house in 1895, I was in the heart of London. The river was not far from my home. I went to the top of a large hill and looked around. There was no sign of the city. The only buildings were the ones close to me. The river had changed over the years. I could see that it had moved about a mile away from where it used to be. I walked back toward the great hall. I came across something that had been a large building, but now it was all junk. Flowers and grass grew over it. I noticed that something else was different. There were no small houses. Everyone lived together in the buildings I saw when I arrived. They all ate together and wore the same kind of clothes. And there was even more sameness. I hadn't noticed it before. I began to look closer at the little people. It was hard to tell which of them were men and which were women. I also couldn't tell if the children were boys or girls. They looked just like smaller models of their parents. I was full of wonder. So this was the world of the future. People were weak, but they didn't have to be strong. There was no heavy work to do. There were no wars to fight. Food grew all around. The people didn't have to plant the fruit, and they didn't have to pick it, except when they were hungry. With no work to be done, people had grown lazy. All they did was eat and play. I was seeing Earth in the sunset of human history. It wasn't just that most of the buildings were in ruins. The minds of the people were the saddest ruins of all. Fewer people lived in that world than in our own time. But there was no war and no sickness. The people must have come up with a way to control their numbers. That way, there would be enough food and space for everyone. So I thought then, but as it turned out, I was wrong. I was very wrong, and in a way that is almost too awful to speak of. Chapter 5. The Machine Disappears. As I stood thinking, I looked around me. The sun had set. There was a bright full moon coming up. I looked down from the small hill I had climbed. I knew I would need to find a place to sleep. I tried to spot the big building where I had eaten dinner. I saw the Sphinx. It got clearer as the moon grew brighter. I looked for the lawn I had landed on. Yes, I could see the flowering bushes. Then a chill came over me. No, that can't be the same lawn, I said to myself. I looked again. But it was the same lawn. Suddenly, I was filled with fear. The time machine was gone. I ran down the hill. I fell a few times and scratched my face. When I reached the lawn, the time machine was nowhere in sight. Maybe the little people put it in the bushes, I thought. Like a crazy man, I began to look through the bushes. I searched through the bushes around the Sphinx, but the machine wasn't there. I remember that I scared some kind of animal in the bushes. I didn't see it, but I heard it run away. At the time, I thought it might be a deer. I learned later just what that animal was. I ran back to the big hall. The full moon lit my way. I burst into the room. All around me, The little people were sleeping on cushions on the floor. If they were surprised the first time they saw me, what must they have thought this time? I was cut, and my clothes were torn from beating the bushes. I cried out in a loud voice, "Where is my time machine?" To see better in the dim light, I lit a match. This really scared them, and they jumped up. My heart sank inside me. They were afraid of the match. People had sunk so low that they had forgotten how to make fire. Suddenly, I couldn't bear to look at them. With a wild cry, I knocked several of them over. I ran outside again into the moonlight. I went back to where the time machine had been. I must have looked around there for hours. Finally, I got so tired and felt so bad that I fell down on the lawn and slept. In the morning, I tried to get some help from the little people. They just weren't interested. It was hard to stop myself from hitting their smiling faces. I went from one to the other trying to find out something, anything, but it was no use. I went back to the lawn where I'd slept. Then I saw something. There were deep tracks in the grass. Someone had dragged the time machine away. I followed the tracks. They led me to the base of the White Sphinx. I looked up and saw that there were two big metal doors at the base of the Sphinx. My time machine was inside the Sphinx. I looked for a long time, trying to find some kind of doorknob or handle. I had to get inside. I had to find the time machine. But how did doors open in the year 802,701? Maybe the little people knew. I spotted one of them walking nearby. I grabbed his arm and led him toward the Sphinx. He looked scared, and he ran away. I was used to the little people not caring about anything, but this fear was new. I tried asking others for help, but they all acted the same way. They were all frightened. Finally, I gave up trying to get their help. I went to the ruin of the big building and took a big rock from it. I went to the metal base of the Sphinx. I began to pound on it with the stone. I don't know how long I hammered. The metal was very old. Parts of it turned to dust under my blows, but I really didn't make a dent in it. In the end, I gave up. I went back to the big hall. Everything was different. It was as if I had some sickness and the little people were afraid of catching it. For 2 days, no one spoke to me. No one even came near me. I thought that maybe the Sphinx was some kind of god to them. Maybe I had done a bad thing hammering away at it. That's what I thought, anyway. I was to find out later how wrong I was. During the next few days, I took the chance to really look around. I climbed the highest hills I could find. Besides the buildings and the Sphinx, only a few towers rose above the trees. They looked like big chimneys. I found another strange thing while I was walking around. There were deep round holes in the ground. Low walls stood around them. At first, I thought they were water wells, but when I looked into one, I could not see a bottom. I dropped a rock into it. I didn't hear it hit bottom. There was no splash. I took a piece of paper from my pocket. I dropped it down. I thought it would go down slowly, but in a moment it was sucked down out of sight. I hung my head over the edge. From the darkness below, I heard a thump thump sound. It was like the heartbeat of a huge animal. I wondered what was down in those holes. Other things bothered me. Where did the people's clothes come from? Everyone was well dressed, but there were no factories to make clothes. Where did their sandals come from? They were well made, but none of the little people I met could have made them. They didn't even know how to make fire. Who kept this world going? Then there was the question of my time machine. Someone or something had dragged it into the Sphinx. Why? And what were those wells without water? What were those strange tall chimneys? What were they for? I felt I had clues, but it was all still a mystery. It was like finding a stone with words cut into it. Some of the words were in English. The rest might have been in Chinese. Then On my third day in the year 802,701, my break came. On that day, I made a friend. A group of little people were wading in a stream near the big buildings. One of them slipped on a rock. She was caught by the fast-moving water. What happened next was hard to believe. No one tried to help her. No, it was worse than that. No one even paid attention. The poor creature was being carried away by the water. She was making little helpless cries. She might as well have been a rock or a tree. No one cared. When I saw that no one was going to help, I dived into the stream and pulled her out. She was cold, so I rubbed her hands and feet. In a few minutes, she came around. By now, I had learned not to wait for a thank you. I left her there. That happened in the morning. In the afternoon, I met her again. When she saw me, she began to smile. She greeted me in her odd language. She made a chain of flowers and put it around my neck. In a few minutes, we were sitting and talking. I shouldn't say talking. We were mostly smiling and waving our hands. She kissed my hands. I kissed hers. Using the few words I knew, I learned that her name was Weena. It was the beginning of an odd friendship that lasted for a week. It ended, as I will tell you. When I saved Weena, I didn't understand what I had gotten myself into. She followed me around like a puppy. Whenever I left her, she was upset. All she wanted to do was be near me. I began to look forward to seeing her as well. Not that there was anything between us. She was like a young child. But I learned things from Weena. I learned that fear hadn't left this strange world. Oh, Weena was brave in the daylight, but she was awfully afraid of the dark. And it wasn't only Weena who felt that way. All the little people stayed in the big house after dark. They never slept alone. I was such a fool that I didn't learn from their fear. I kept sleeping outside. Chapter 6. The Morlocks and the Eloi. One morning just before dawn, I woke up. It was that gray time of night, just before the sun comes up. It's then that your eyes can play tricks on you. I looked at the hills. I thought I saw ghosts. I looked again. I saw white, ape-like creatures. They seemed to be carrying a dark body. I looked again, and they were gone. I rubbed my eyes. At the time, I felt that I had seen something important, but after the sun came up, I passed it off in my mind as a dream. I said nothing about it to Weena. I should have. I could have learned something. Instead, I had to learn the hard way. The next day was very hot. I had been walking around trying to learn more about this future world, but the heat was too much for me. I spotted what looked like a cave. It seemed cool and dark, so I went inside. Suddenly, I froze. In the dark, I saw two red eyes watching me. I called out. I guess my voice didn't sound very brave. Then I reached out and touched something soft in the dark. The red eyes darted from side to side. Something ran past me. I turned and saw a strange ape-like figure run out of the cave. It kept its head down in an odd way. It ran right into a big stone and fell down. Then the thing got up again and ran into another cave. I didn't get a good look at it. It was white and had large reddish-gray eyes. Its white hair grew all the way down its back. I couldn't tell for sure if it walked on all fours. Maybe it just held its arms very low. Holding back my fear, I followed it. I went inside the other cave. There was no trace of the white thing, but I did find another one of those wells. Could the thing have gone down there? I lit a match and looked down the hole. I saw the thing. It was climbing down the sides of the hole. There were metal bars on the sides of the well. The thing was climbing down using these handholds. It looked like an evil white spider. I felt almost sick looking at it. Then my match burned out. All was darkness again. I don't know how long I stood there thinking. Then the truth came to me. Even though the creature I saw didn't look human, it was. In the future, there were two kinds of humans. The little people lived above the ground. The white ape-like people lived below ground. I understood why the thing had run right into that big stone. From living underground for so many years, it was not used to light. That also explained why the thing had such big wide eyes. It was like a cat or an owl. Those eyes helped it to see in the dark. I started to think about why some people lived under the ground while others lived in the sunshine above. It started back in our time, in 1895. Back then, many people worked in factories all day. They made the fancy clothes and things that the rich people could buy. But they spent all their time indoors and hardly ever saw the sun. They worked all their lives just so that rich people could have a good time. It seemed clear to me. The little people wore clothes and sandals that the white things made. Instead of being thankful, the little people just enjoyed what the underground people did for them. They gave nothing, while the creatures underground lived like moles. I had a feeling that this world was like a beautiful ripe apple that had worms in the center. As best as I could, I told Weena what I had seen. She didn't want to talk about it. However, she did tell me that the things living underground had a name. They were called Morlocks. For the first time, I also heard the name of the beautiful little people. They were called the Eloi. I was disgusted with the Eloi. What did they do to keep things going? Nothing. The poor Morlocks made this world run. And what did they get in return? An awful life underground. Weena tried to tell me more about the Morlocks, but I didn't know enough of the Eloi language to understand what she said. I tried again to understand. I asked Weena more questions. She broke into tears. These were the first tears I had seen in this world. Weena was nice, and I couldn't stand to see her cry. I stopped asking her about the Morlocks. I lit a match for her. She liked that. I think she thought it was magic. In a few minutes, she was smiling and clapping her hands, and I was lighting one match after another.